Let me just begin by saying that everything that the IFC says about consumer protection is not there in the handbook, because there are many substantive powers of consumer protection and all which cannot be voluntarily adopted. They require legislative amendments, which will take some time to happen. So let me give you a little bit of background about how this started. The FSLRC did a proper review of the existing framework of consumer protection in the laws, and what they found is basically, three things. One is that even though most of the laws in finance have some consumer protection, investor protection, policyholder protection language in them, and the objective is given to the regulators to ensure that there is an investor protection or consumer protection, this notion of investor protection and consumer protection is not properly detailed and defined. So what does it mean to protect the consumer is not clearly stated in the law. The second is that in the law there is not clear guidance on what powers and principles must be applied to ensure these objectives of consumer protection are met. So it's just some broad powers are given and a very broad consumer protection objective is given, and then the regulators are supposed to go and pursue the objectives that they set for themselves in defining the consumer protection objective. And this has led to a variety of approaches, and to the credit of regulators in India, they have done considerable work on consumer protection. They have been thinking and worrying about it and issuing regulations. So IRDA, SEBI, RBI, all of them have done work on this. But the general approach, according to our reading, is a combination of approaches. There are disclosures. So all the regulators, not almost, all the regulators actually have substantive disclosure requirements. They have financial capability approaches. So financial literacy is very important for many of the regulators as an approach to consumer protection. Caveat emptor is still a very dominant thing. So buyer beware still seems to be one of the dominant philosophies of consumer protection in finance in India. And there is, of course, some kind of grievance redress system that different regulators have developed to some extent. So when the PFRD was saying they are developing it right now. And there are some notable exceptions and some deviations from this standard narrative that we found in the consumer protection in finance. And so this was the background. And then FSLRC did a little bit of thinking on it based on the modern research in household finance, in household behavior in general, how households use financial services, how they lead their economic lives. They looked at international experiences also, and that's been a very useful experience for FSLRC, and all of us who have been associated with FSLRC. What does it tell us about how to look at consumer protection? The few insights kind of stand out. The first is that we always underestimate, at least we underestimated before we entered this space, that households have extraordinarily busy lives. And this whole approach of financial literacy and building capability in households on finance is almost tantamount to saying that every household should become a doctor because health care is important. Every household should have a doctor. So because it's not going to happen, it's extremely complex. In my previous job, I was involved in developing a wealth management framework for households. And when I got into that job, I was really surprised to see how complex the issue is. So for example, a question like how much insurance that a person should buy. It's an incredibly difficult question. The rule of thumbs that advisors today use are absolutely baseless in modern financial economics. So I'll give you one example. We look at annual income and some multiple of that is used for deciding how much insurance one should buy. But that is absolutely meaningless. It has some meaning. It is a part of the model. Very important, the interdependencies of human capital. For example, if your dependent also is making money or has a potential of making money by taking up a job, if suppose the person who is the main earner expires, that is a huge determinant of how much insurance should buy. And that needs to be built into the model. And it's a complex modeling that has to go into deciding how much insurance should buy. That's just one financial service. If you talk about the full portfolio of services, there is risk management, there is consumption smoothing, there is investment. It's a very complex optimization problem. And households, if we want to build capability in them, we want them to look at disclosures and decide what is good for them. That approach will only take us to a certain distance and may in many contexts do a lot of harm also. So this complexity has to be recognized. The households are busy, they don't have time for a lot of responsibility, to take a lot of responsibility for financial decisions has to be recognized. expertise not easy to build at household level has to be recognized. So these three are kind of common principles that came to the Commission's recognition. Next was the need to differentiate. So it's this narrative holds for households and small firms. It doesn't hold for large firms because they are able to act in a more rational manner. They are able to access more information. They have better computational capabilities. They have better analytical capabilities. They are able to find better solutions for themselves. So you need some differentiation between household small firms and large firms. And so that led the Commission to the conclusion that regulation must create an environment where households are able to use finance to improve their lives. So, and that is a complex kind of a objective with which Commission started its work. This I'm talking about is the early stage of Commission's work on consumer protection. Then it came to some conclusions about how that can be ensured, and we'll talk about that. And that is a very ambitious agenda that was set for financial regulation in FSLRC. So this, based on these basic assumptions about household finance and household behavior, these are the basic tenets of the FSLRC approach to consumer protection that were decided on. One is that the consumer protection regime should be significantly based on the notion of seller behavior and not so much on buyer behavior. So as we have in, say, medicine, healthcare, this is a complex science. It needs expertise, and only to an extent you can leave the decision to the consumer completely. Of course, the consumer is free to buy services and decide on its own, but that doesn't mean the provider is completely, absolved of the responsibility. So you need to have a regime in which seller has majority of the responsibility, if not significantly more than that. Second principle in the approach is that consumer protection is the central objective of all financial regulation. So that is something that early on the Commission decided, that consumer protection is not just one of the things that the regulator does. In fact, the microprudential regulation, the safety and soundness of banks, the primary rationale for that is consumer protection. Because you want to protect depositors, because you want to protect insurance policy holders, you want the banks to not die, you want the insurance companies to not die. So that is to be the guiding kind of light for all financial regulation. Third is that in the law, there should be some guidance on what consumer protection means. You can't leave it entirely to the regulators to decide what it means. The Parliament has to take a view, and the Commission is just through draft law recommending to the Parliament that these are the different aspects of consumer protection that needs to be maintained and ensured. You can't completely leave the word consumer protection undefined in the law. It has to be provided as guidance. And as I said earlier, there are some enhanced protections that are required for retail consumers who are unsophisticated consumers. A defined term, we'll come to that later. And last is that some kind of an ex post grievance redressal is required, because all the problems cannot be prevented. Some have to be cured once the abuse has happened or something like that. Now, this approach led to this kind of framework for consumer protection, where the objective is in terms of what is consumer protection is defined in terms of 6 basic rights and protections for every consumer in the economy, and every consumer of financial services in the economy. And over and above these 6, 3 additional protections are given to what are called retail consumers. These are unsophisticated individuals and small firms. And what are retail consumers? That is to be defined by regulators. That's the power that is left to the regulator. The intent is to have all individuals covered, but firms, small firms only. Now, what small firms are covered will be decided by the regulator, and also in terms of what is the value of the service that is being used. So individuals, maybe you want to leave Mukesh Ambani out. So that is something that you can consider. If someone buys 5,000 crore rupees, insurance need not be covered, but maybe a 2 crore rupees insurance should be covered. But only principle that the FSLRC can tell is that this is an inclusive kind of a group. So when you're trying to define a retail consumer or unsophisticated consumer, don't try to have a very restricted kind of a group. Only exclude the obvious ones. So only exclude the Mukesh Ambani or some big industrialist who is buying very, very high value insurance products and investing thousands of crore rupees. Those leave out, but otherwise most individuals should be in that. And so that's the objective of consumer protection regulation. And then the Commission in the draft Indian Financial Code has some enumerated powers. So these are not plenary powers. These are not godlike powers to do anything you want. These are powers that are enlisted. It's enumerated. A, B, C, D only you can do. There is no E, there is no F. And unfortunately, because powers require legislative changes, that's not in the handbook, and we're not going to get too much into it. Some powers are discussed in the handbook which we feel can be addressed in the current laws. Those we'll get into, but many powers are not there. And lastly, the law has some principles that are supposed to guide the use of power. So now, just think about it. You're given some objective to pursue in some powers. Now, you can go too far in trying to pursue that objective also. For example, you are supposed to ensure that disclosures happen. There is some optimality of disclosure. Excessive disclosure is also bad. Too little disclosure is also bad. So some principles are given in the law to decide how these powers should be used. These principles we're not going to get into because, again, these are not in the handbook. So we're going to focus mainly on the protections and rights and go through them one by one and try to develop a common understanding of what each of them actually means. So this is the FSDC resolution on voluntary adoption. It said that these 9 rights and protections for consumers must be maintained for all the financial sectors. So the first 6, which are in black, are for all consumers, and the last 3 are only for the retail consumers, which means that retail consumers have 9 sets of protections and all other consumers have only 6. And I'll go through them one by one. So but before I get into that, let me just describe what is the nature of these rights and protections. So each of the right or protection comes from some market failure that exists in the economy. So many of them come from the fact that there is information asymmetry in the financial market. So banks know much more about the health of the banks than the depositors know. Insurance companies know much more about insurance products than the consumer knows. So a lot of it is based on this assumption that there is information asymmetry. Many of these protections are based on the assumption that there is a disproportionate market power that providers have over the consumer. So you need some protections that emanate from them. And some of them also come from an understanding of household behavior that I described earlier to you. So that's one aspect of the rights and protections. The other is that the law, when it comes into force, will directly apply to all the financial providers. So all these protections will have to be ensured directly by the provider, even though regulator will make some regulations under that law. But when it comes into being, the provider, so if a chairman of a bank or a CEO of an insurance company has to read the law directly and see, okay, this is the protection that I need to ensure, what kind of a policy I need to have in my company to ensure that these protections are given to all the consumers. It's not just a complete delegation to the regulator to decide what consumer protection means and how it has to be ensured. And the third is, of course, regulators are given sufficient powers to maintain these rights and protections. So let me go through the 6 that apply to all consumers. The first one is on unfair terms in financial contracts. And none of these ideas are absolutely new, frankly, because we've seen these already, some forms of regulation in India already, and of course across the world, where these ideas are kind of embedded. But this is an attempt to create a common set of principles which guide the entire financial system, regulation and consumer protection. And so let's go through them in that spirit. So unfair term is defined as a term which causes a significant imbalance in the rights and obligations of parties to the detriment of the consumer. So the opposite is allowed. If you are causing a detriment to the financial service provider, that is allowed, if that can happen ever. And very importantly, it should not be reasonably necessary to protect the legitimate interests of the financial service provider. So it is possible that you can cause a detriment for the consumer as long as there is a legitimate interest of the FSP which has been protected by that particular term. It's vague. I'll give you some examples to make it clear. While you are trying to determine whether a term is unfair or not, there are a few considerations that are given in the Indian Financial Code which have also been provided in the handbook. First is, how transparent is a term? So was it easy to understand? Was it given a clear language? Was it in a couched language? So there are some principles that define what transparency of the term means. Second is, depending on the nature of the service. So every service has a same term, can be unfair for one service and can be very fair for another service. So for example, a mutual fund can say that I'm not going to provide you regular information about my performance. You have to come and see what is going on. While some other kind of investment product can say that no, you have to provide on a regular basis because I have to take a decision. I have committed to take a decision on a weekly basis or monthly basis to invest or continue the investment or withdraw. So depending on what the context is, you can decide what kind of a term is unfair. Then you have to look at the term in the context of the full contract. A term that looks unfair in one I mean, looking on its own, maybe actually fair if you look at the whole contract. There may be some balancing principle. For example, some right has been taken away from you to suppose you cannot close the contract in the first year. That right has been taken away from you. But the financial service provider has that right. So that's a clear imbalance, right? That they can shut you out in a year, but you can't withdraw within a year. But maybe there is some consideration that was paid to do that. So they reduce the price that you paid. In telecom, we have these 2-year packages that we get. I mean, on the face of it, they may seem like very unfair packages. You can't exit for 2 years, you can't exit for 1 year. But there's a consideration. You get a cheaper service because of that, and that is a decision you've taken. So as a whole, if you look at the contract, that is on an unfair term. But another important fact is that unfair term is unfair only in a non-negotiated contract. If the contract was negotiated between two parties, then there is no concept of an unfair term, because that by definition means that you agreed and you were happy to get into this kind of a contract. So now non-negotiated contract, you have to think about what it means. One easy answer is all standard form contracts, which cover most of the contracts that we enter as retail consumers, ordinary consumers in the financial market, are non-negotiated. And also contracts in which there was no substantial opportunity to negotiate with the financial service provider, the consumer did not have opportunity, is a non-negotiated contract. So when you think about unfair term of contract, you think of all these tests. There has to be an imbalance between the rights and obligations of the parties to the detriment of consumer. There has to be no legitimate protection of the FSP's interest in that particular term, and it has to be a non-negotiated contract. This combination creates an unfair term of contract, so to speak. And regulators have been given the power to publish a list of unfair term of contracts in specific context, very nuanced. You have a 5-page regulation which says actually only one term that is in this such and such context is unfair. And if the term is found to be unfair, it can be declared void. But that doesn't mean that the entire contract will become void, only that term. If the contract can stand without that term, the contract will continue to stand. Some examples from international experiences here, like suppose there are term that gives only one party the right to avoid or limit performance of the contract. If only one party has the right to terminate the contract. Now each of these, as I said, has to be seen in the context of the full contract. Like the telecom example we took, only the telecom provider has the right to suspend your 2-year package, but you don't have the right, but you paid for it, so it's maybe this termination of the contract is also not an unfair term. The right to vary the terms of contract lie only with one party, so you don't have to take the customer's permission before you change the asset allocation in the mutual fund. Now that is something that you've agreed to do, but it can be unfair in some other context, so you've not agreed to do that beforehand. So you have to look at even this in the full context. The right to renew or not renew the contract. Like if you look at banking, a floating interest loan where interest only floats one way. That's a clear unfair term of contract, because it has, if interest rate goes down, the interest should flow the other way also. So I mean, these are the practical examples, and these are more principles example. So in the contract you've taken away the right to sue another party. So you can't sue your bank, you can't sue your insurance contract. That again creates an imbalance. So these are examples. There are many other examples from common law countries of what unfair terms of contract means. Next, protection is against unfair conduct, where there are two aspects. There is misleading conduct and abusive conduct. Misleading conduct is basically, again defined in principles terms. This is all principles-based language. Is any conduct that is likely to cause the consumer to take a transactional decision that the consumer would not have taken. And this includes specifically two things: providing inaccurate information, or providing accurate information in a deceptive manner. So we have seen, in insurance especially, we've seen many examples in the last few years of massive mis-selling going on in ULIPs and all that. So a 15-year product which was sold by the agent as a 3-year money doubling product, and then of course after that they dropped off and led to a huge loss for consumers. Lakhs of crores were lost for consumers because consumer protection was not done. Basically that was the reason. And providing accurate information in a deceptive manner. Pretty much every day I see some advertisement which is on the face of it deceptive. Like the other day I look at some very reputed financial firm which had this guaranteed return product, and in the entire advertisement nowhere it had written what is the guaranteed return on. So is it on the premium? Is it on sum assured? What is it that you guarantee a 12% return on? And that's a very basic information that you need to be able to make a right decision. And you may assume something. People assume some basis for the 12% return, 11% return, and that information is not given. That's a deceptive kind of information, I would say. But it's provided, information is provided, but in a deceptive manner. Now, next is abusive conduct, and there are a few examples of that we've seen in India. This is the use of coercion or undue influence, and that undue influence and coercion should have the chance of leading the consumer to take a decision that they would have otherwise not taken. So we've seen examples in banking, for example, the direct sales agent, they went into aggressive loan collection practices and all that. So that's the other aspect of unfair conduct. The third is the types of fair disclosures that must be ensured. Again, principles based. There are two sets of disclosures that must be made. One is initial, the other is continuing. Initial disclosure is disclosure that is required to make the initial informed transactional decision. And a fair disclosure is defined as in terms of three principles. One is it should be provided sufficiently before the consumer enters into a contract. Second, it should be provided in writing and in a manner that is likely to be understood by a consumer. And writing is not defined as writing, it's online and all is covered, of course, in writing. And third is in a manner that enables the consumer to make reasonable comparisons. So don't use non-standard language. For example, return, don't use it as a denominator some number which is absolutely not standard practice. So use the common language, so that people can compare different products. These three would be the principles to decide what are fair disclosures. So, and the basic initial disclosure you need are on risks of the product, fees to be paid, exclusions. So no hidden language and all will be allowed in this. And then there is continuing disclosure. So once you've bought the product, you enter the contract, there is information you need to know. You need to know information if there is some substantial change in the information that was provided early on. Some risk information has changed. So you have to be told that has happened so that you can take your transactional decision to continue or exit. If some kind of a status has changed, a performance information which has to be given regularly, some mutual funds keep sending us reports on their performance, or if some obligation has changed, or obligation is continuing. For example, I have to pay my credit card bill. The credit card company has to tell me that I have to pay this amount by this date. If it fails to do that, it is gross dereliction of its responsibility to continuing disclosures, and then I'm not able to meet my obligation, I'm not able to pay, and I have to pay penalties and all that. So now, and then of course regulator can specify other disclosures also which are required and continuing. This is only in the stated in the draft law. Now, continuing disclosure has to happen within a specified period of time, a reasonable period of time that can be specified by the regulator, or can be, if specified, if the regulator is silent on it, then the FSP has to take a view of what is reasonable, and then the courts will decide whether that was reasonable or not. And it has to be given in a writing and in a manner that is, again, likely to be understood. So, for example, I give the example of payments owed by the consumer that are very important. Mutual fund performance is another example where it's important to know on a regular basis what is going on with the product. And regulators may, and this term may and must, you will see. In some, the regulators have a choice to make a regulation, and some they must because the law obligates them. And now the handbook and the FSGC resolution obligate them. So regulators may specify the types of initial and continuous disclosure to be made, provide for the manner in which a disclosure has to be made. So whether you have to give them a call sometimes, or you're supposed to send them an email, what is the format, can it be a 30-page disclosure which couches many different kind of messages and hides the main message in it. So there is some restriction that the regulator can put. And regulator, very importantly, has the power to exempt financial service providers from disclosure obligations, and that is very relevant at times. So there are some financial services like payments and all, where disclosure is not very relevant. You just go online, make a payment. You don't want to know 10,000 information about how that is happening. Let that be at the back end, and these exemptions are very important. So the regulators have the power to do that. The fourth protection is in terms of having some kind of an effective redress mechanism at each FSP. Now, this has to be thought through because many FSPs are basically individuals, brokers and all. You have to think about how can they have an effective redress. So this is a principles-based obligation. This does not necessarily mean that each organization should have an in-house redress mechanism. You can have a redress mechanism through an SRO, which is providing the redress on your behalf, but you need to have some redress mechanism which you are accountable to as a financial service provider. And you have to keep the consumer informed about what they can do to seek redress if they feel that they you have short-changed them, there's some kind of an abuse that has happened. So this is an obligation that applies to every financial service provider, and the regulator can then has to make regulation on what are the standards of process to be followed. So different sectors have different kind of requirements, so you have to make regulations on them, and it has a choice to make regulations on record maintenance. So for example, regulator wants them to keep the records of consumer complaint for next 5 years. So that's a regulation to be made. It's not in the primary law. An alternate dispute resolution mechanism, that's the SRO and those kind of models, which are very much allowed in the law. You don't have to have an in-house redress mechanism. If you're a small organization, that's not feasible perhaps. Next is just a general protection of personal information and the obligation to maintain confidentiality that every FSP has. Personal information is basically defined as any information that relates to a consumer or allows the consumer's identity to be inferred. It's a very broad principles-based definition, but then there are checks and balances. Regulators are given power to give exemptions and all that. But the law is principles-based. And then the obligation is to collect only relevant personal information that you need for the transactional decision as an FSP to maintain confidentiality, except as provided. So regulator can specify in what cases you can share the information with regulator or with other FSPs, so credit bureaus and all, that is possible. Ensure personal information is accurate, up to date, and complete. You have to make best effort, a reasonable effort at least, to maintain the accuracy and the quality of the information that you are keeping. Because for many businesses it's necessary to do that because there are consequences. For example, I didn't repay my loan in 1 month, I was delayed, but I actually paid the next month. So immediately that information should come. It should not be delayed, otherwise I have a risk of my credit score going down or something like that. And consumers should have reasonable access to their personal information, and you can charge for it also. If there's suppose a credit bureau, they can charge. If there's a bank, then I have to give for free because my information, I have a relationship with them. And so the reasonable access should be there, and the consumer should have the opportunity to seek modifications. If they think that information is inaccurate, they should have the opportunity to make that case and then get the information changed or updated. The contestability of the information has to be ensured. And there are some examples about banks sharing consumer debt information, insurance companies sharing the information they collected at the time of claims, and banks sharing the biometric information. These will be all violations of these requirements. Even the principles of the requirement, these are, I think, clear violations. Then in the sixth protection, couple of common law principles have been encoded. One is the principle of honest market practice, and the other is the principle of good faith, both of which comprise the general principle of professional due diligence, the requirement of professional due diligence, which every consumer should get from every financial service provider. And of course, the obligation will vary depending on how much experience and expertise a consumer has, what is the level of dependence that the consumer have on FSC. For example, an advisor relationship and a distributor relationship are very different relationships, and the level of diligence, professional diligence required varies significantly between these two. And these are common law principles which, for hundreds of years have been built through jurisprudence in various countries. We also have them actually in practice. It's just an effort to encode them in the law. Now I'll get into the three protections that the retail consumers only enjoy. And of course, they enjoy the other six as well, and they enjoy these three in addition to that. The first is the right to suitability of advice. And I want to be precise here that this protection applies only to retail consumers who are individuals and small enterprises as you may define. And this applies only to advisors. So if you are someone, you are an FSP who is giving advice to a consumer, at that point this protection kicks in. Once you are decided to become an advisor, de facto or actually on paper advisor, some people are actually distributor but they give in practice advice. So in principle, if you're giving advice, you are caught by this. You have to do two things at least to begin with. You have to make efforts to obtain correct and adequate information about the relevant personal circumstances of the consumer. And so if you're buying insurance, if you're selling insurance or giving advice on insurance, you have to make reasonable efforts to collect basic information about, of course, age, income, interdependencies, within the household, those kind of things which should go into deciding how much insurance you should buy and all those kind of things. And then use this information to create an advice that is suitable for the retail consumer. That is a basic obligation that you need to have if you're giving advice. And that protection is given in the Indian Financial Code whenever it comes into being, and it's in the handbook and FSB resolutions also. And over and above these, there are a couple of other obligations also. Suppose you seek information from the consumer and you have reasonable reasons to believe that the information that was given to you is incomplete or inaccurate, and that won't form a basis for a good advice. You have an obligation to tell that, at least to the consumer, that I don't think this is going to be sufficient, but if you want to go ahead, go ahead. Because the right ultimately is of the consumer, but the provider has the obligation to at least warn them once that this is not a good idea to go ahead. Second obligation is that suppose the consumer says, no, I don't want any advice, or I don't want to share information, I just want to buy a certain product. At that point, you have to warn them that it's not a good idea. In this kind of a product, it's good to have an advice, and I will not advise that this is a suitable product for you. Then of course this is their decision. Under this protection, the regulator has two kind of set of powers. One is must specify the services that can only be provided with advice. So you can, as regulator, specify that life insurance cannot be sold without advice. You have to give advice. There is no concept of distributor in life insurance. You can say that. I'm not saying you should say that. There are many balancing principles. You have to think about financial inclusion, the cost of advice and all that. You can think about market development, growth and all that. Everything has to be considered, but you have the power to specify which services cannot be provided without being accompanied by advice. So some advice framework has to be given for some services. Which one is up to you to decide. And you may specify over and above that what kind of inquiries the advisor will make from the consumer and what does not constitute advice. This is also very important. That how do you define advice? It's like in this, even though we've tried to define it in Indian Financial Code, it is not an easy principle. So sometimes, for example, is an advertisement an advice? Even though in our law it is clearly defined that advice is personal advice. Advice is defined as personal advice directed towards you. But what if you get a mailer, or a pamphlet? It came to your house. Is that advice? Now that is a gray area, right? But I would say it's not advice because it's just a part of the general campaign to reach out to people. So regulator can say that these are exceptions and this is not personal advice. A pamphlet coming to your home, even though directed towards you, does not constitute advice. These are gray areas for which regulator has been given the power to create exceptions, tell what does not constitute advice. The next set of protections for retail consumers only is the protection against conflicts of interest. Now, it's been defined. It's a defined term. We don't mean it in a very general sense. It mostly refers to conflicted remuneration, which is a big issue in finance. So if there are two obligations here. One is that if you have conflicted remuneration as a financial service provider, you have to inform the consumer that, hey, I'm talking to you about this, but know this, that I am conflicted. I'm going to get my money from somewhere else. 40% of the first year premium I'm going to get. You should know that I am going to get that, and my advice may be twisted because of that. At least you should know there's a conflict of interest. Conflicted remuneration is defined. You can read this. Any benefit, monetary or non-monetary, derived from persons other than the retail consumers to whom you're giving the advice, that could, under the circumstances, reasonably be expected to influence the advice given. That's a principles-based advice, and we actually found a lot of commonality in this definition in other parts of the world. So there is, I think, a lot of common shared wisdom around this. So you have to first share the information that you have some kind of a conflict of interest. You should know, and you should be careful. Second is that if there's a conflict, now there's a direct obligation in this, that if there's a conflict between your interest and the consumer interest, or if you're a representative of FSP, then the FSP's interest and the consumer interest, you are obligated to give preference to the consumer's interest. You cannot say that I did this because it is in my interest or in the interest of the firm I was representing. The balance of preference, so to speak, is towards the consumer. That's your obligation in the law, and it's not automatically it's not going to happen. You have to put some kind of a regulation, some kind of a law to ensure that happens. Here again, regulators have some powers to. This is not must. May specify circumstances in which certain benefits may or may not be considered to be conflicted, because as I said, this is the principles-based definition of conflicted remuneration. You have to be more precise, and that depends on sectors, and every regulator has the power to specify that. And they can also restrict certain kind of incentives. So you can restrict certain structures of remuneration. What FSLRC debated and decided is that regulators should not have the power to decide how much you can pay to your email agent and how much you can pay to your employees, but the structure of remuneration matters. What do you get paid for? What behavior do you incentivize? What behavior do you not incentivize? So those are the powers that are given to the regulators. You can decide circumstances in which benefits may or may not be considered to be completed, and then what kind of incentives are allowed and not allowed. The last one, and I don't want to talk too much about it because it's not going to much is not going to happen in the short run, is that the FSLRC has imagined rather a full-fledged financial redress agency, which will be like an amalgamation of all the existing ombudsman and grievance redress systems, which will be your one-stop shop for all financial services grievance redressal, and it will work through two-step process. It will do first mediation, so you have a chance to settle with the consumer who has come to complain against you. The other is adjudication, so it will be a quick quasi-judicial process which will give small compensations or to consumers if there's been an abuse. And it will, the way FSLRC is imagined, it will have presence across the country, should have at least some front-end presence in every district, if through some partner or through NGO or something, so that you can get complaints registered, and then the adjudication and hearings may happen only in a few centers across the country through video conferencing and all. It is envisaged to use modern technology and all that. So hopefully when the law passes in the next few years, this should come into play, and all the current systems of redress should come together. Now the value of that, of course, I mean, one could debate, but in my view the biggest value is that today finance is becoming very integrated. You go to a bank, you can buy banking products, you can invest in mutual funds, you can buy insurance, all of that. So your front end is just the bank. So for every service you have to go to a different kind of redress mechanism. It's very inconvenient for the client, and this kind of a system will take care of that. Many products have multiple features embedded in them. There's an investment feature, there's also an insurance feature. You don't know where to go. It's not very clear. If you have one-stop shop, it's become much easier. So there are many advantages to it, but there's not that much that's going to happen till the law comes into being. FRA will not be established full-fledgedly, at least before the law comes into being. There will be some preparatory work that will happen before that. Just 2 minutes I'll talk about what perhaps you can do to, having understood these principles, or you can go back and read the Indian Financial Code, read the handbook again, read the international examples that are given in a handbook about what these protections and rights mean. But once you've understood what they are, there are a few things that you can do within your own capacity. First, you can review your own sectoral consumer protection regulations in light of these rights and protections. So you can see what is that you've provided protections against, and what is it that you might have missed. And even if you have, suppose, very substantial disclosure requirements imposed upon your regulated entities, are they consistent with these principles? So that will be, I think, useful to, at least as a first step. Second, identify some gaps. Maybe there are some gaps, some things you have not protected against, some protections are incomplete, or maybe IFC has got some things wrong. So feedback also has to come back to the ministry that maybe there are some other protections that are required and all that. So identify the gaps in existing regulations, and then identify legal constraints. So maybe there are good reasons for why certain protections have not been given by you in your regulations, because you don't have the power in the law to do that perhaps. Though it's very difficult to believe that, because almost all regulators have plenary powers. They have many residual powers which they can use to give protections at least. But it will be good to know if there are some legal constraints. And lastly, it would be great if some new draft regulations are made to enhance protections for consumers, if there are gaps that are identified between the current regulations and these principles-based protections that are identified by the FSLRC. And on redress, I would say, even though the consolidated agency may take some time to come, it will be good to identify the gaps in the current redress systems, do a proper documentation of the best practices there, and try and start a conversation about having a consolidated redress infrastructure. There are many good economies of scale and scope, both that can work in this system. It will be good to have that conversation, but I'm not saying that everything has to happen on day one. It's just that this process has to start, and this thinking about consumer protection in terms of these 9 protections and rights will be good to start now.